Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qizhi. Coming up in this edition, the World Health Organization says Israel and Hamas have agreed to halt hostilities in Gaza for a polio vaccination campaign starting on Sunday. Leaders of Pacific Island countries have wrapped up their annual meeting in Tonga. And China has released a report on a coral reef ecosystem at Xianbin Jiao, a reef in China's Nansha Islands. We begin on the Middle East. A World Health Organization official says Israel and Hamas have agreed to halt hostilities in Gaza for a polio vaccination campaign led by the organization. Rick Peeperkorn is the head of the WHO office for the West Bank and Gaza. He says the Hamas Health Ministry and the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees will launch the campaign on Sunday to administer the first 2 rounds of the vaccines. Peeperkorn adds that the pause in hostilities for each 3-day campaign may be stretched into a 4th day if necessary. He says over 2,100 workers in nearly 300 teams will administer the oral vaccines to 640,000 children under the age of 10 at nearly 400 sites. The official also says it is critical that they reach 90% of vaccination coverage during each round. The WHO announced plans for the polio vaccination campaign in Gaza after a 10-month-old baby contracted polio, the first confirmed case in the Strip in 25 years. Jody Jacobs reports.
This week alone, the United Nations reported on the dire situation inside Gaza and how escalating violence is compromising its ability to deliver life-saving assistance. On Wednesday, the World Food Programme was forced to pause the movement of its employees following an attack on a team returning from an aid delivery mission just meters from an Israeli-controlled checkpoint. The United Nations says the situation has become so distressing that this month alone, the Israeli military issued 16 evacuation orders in the enclave, leaving thousands of people homeless. An emergency Security Council meeting was convened on Thursday in light of the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. Many council members raised concerns about international humanitarian law that is being violated. The United States warned its ally Israel to ensure UN staff are protected.
These incidents should not happen. Israel must not only take ownership for its mistakes, but also take concrete actions to ensure the IDF does not fire on UN personnel again. Further, all attacks and threatening rhetoric against the UN and humanitarian NGOs need to stop.
China has called on Israel to immediately stop its military operations in both Gaza and the occupied West Bank. It says ceasefire negotiations cannot be delayed any longer or be used as an excuse to continue committing atrocities.
Gaza has now turned into hell on earth. We must never allow the same humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza to happen in the West Bank, which will turn the West Bank into another hell on earth. China opposes any rhetorical action that fuels tension, condemns all attacks on civilians.
Meanwhile, the UN says an agreement has been reached for limited pauses in fighting to allow for a polio vaccination drive to take place in Gaza. The Israeli military and Hamas have agreed to 3-day pauses as hundreds of children need to receive the vaccine after a baby contracted the first confirmed polio case in 25 years in the Palestinian territory. The UN says what the world has witnessed over the past 11 months and continues to witness calls into question the world's commitment to the international legal order that was designed to prevent such tragedies.
That was Jody Jacobs on the coming polio vaccination campaign in Gaza. In the United States, a student protesting the conflict in Gaza has sued the leaders of the University of Texas at Austin. He claims they violated his First Amendment rights after he participated in pro-Palestinian demonstrations last spring. He's facing a prolonged suspension and a ban from campus. Tony Waterman reports.
Amir Kadumi had been one of the main organizers of the pro-Palestinian protests that took place here at the University of Texas Austin campus last spring. And he was front and center on April 24th when the first demonstrations kicked off right here along what is known as the Speedway. The occupation has got to go. It started off very peacefully but quickly devolved into a chaotic standoff between students and campus, city, and state police. In the lawsuit, Kadumi claims that he tried not once, but twice to disperse the crowds, but the police blocked off most routes for dispersal. And it was then, according to the lawsuit, that Kadumi was arrested on criminal trespass charges, one of nearly 60 people to be arrested on that day, although all of the charges were later dropped. But he now faces a 3-semester suspension and a ban from campus over his protest actions, something that he and his lawyers claim violates his First Amendment rights. And they are now suing the university's president and vice president. In the lawsuit, Kadumi's lawyers point to a report released last month by a UT committee which found that the institution's response to the protest violated its own rules, and that claims that the demonstrators broke school code lacked, quote, adequate foundation. UT Austin hasn't responded to a request for comment, but at the time said that while peaceful protests within the school's rules were accepted, breaking the rules and disrupting others' ability to learn were not allowed. A hearing is expected to take place later this week to determine whether Kadumi will be suspended. But this is just one of a handful of lawsuits that have been filed in the wake of what were often very chaotic campus protests last spring. This includes students at the University of California, Irvine, Portland State University, and Columbia.
That's Tony Waterman reporting. Turning to Oceania, the annual meeting of leaders of Pacific Island countries has wrapped up in Tonga. The event gathered 18 regional leaders. Greg Navarro reports from Tonga.
The formal event itself wrapped up just a short time ago. The leaders delivering the communique from this 53rd annual event. Look, we should probably take it from what they keep stressing, the theme this year, transformational change, how the Pacific Islands Forum can meet the needs of not only a changing world, but also a changing region. Remember, this whole area, when you take in all of the water, the ocean as well, represents, according to some experts, up to 20% of the Earth's surface. While these countries are small, this area is huge and is playing an increasingly important role. That includes the members of the 18 nations that make up the Pacific Islands Forum. They talked about the forum itself. They wanted to review the structure, how to make it better to not only adapt to those changing needs of the various countries within this, but also how to rely on agencies. And, of course, climate change, when we talk about the number one threat to this region, it was front and center here again, and it relates to just about all of the topics they've covered. The best way to put it in perspective is, according to Mark Brown, the Prime Minister for the Cook Islands, the former Secretary General here, is to think of it this way. These countries have not been dealing with climate change for the last year or a couple of years. They've been dealing with the impacts for decades, and it is by far the biggest threat, and they are once again calling for action. One of the highlights related to climate change was the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres here speaking on behalf of the Pacific Islands, releasing a couple of very damning reports that talk about how this region is feeling the impacts, feeling the effects from increasing temperatures, increasing rising waters, and calling for action and calling for money. Speaking of that, in this year's forum, they also once again talked about the transformational fund. It's a climate action fund that essentially they're in a resilience center. They're essentially attempting to raise up to $1.5 billion to be used specifically to help pay these countries for not only the damage that they are taking, the hits they are taking, but their resilience programs that they are trying to adapt to and use to deal with the increasing impacts from climate change. They'll eventually take that to the UN later this year to once again create a call for action, in the words of Mark Brown, to help raise even more money. Health and education were very prominent topics for the first time at the Pacific Islands Forum. And for example, when we talk about health, we talk about the rise of communicable diseases, once again related to climate change. Things like diabetes and problems related to obesity are on the rise. And the reason is because of climate change, that countries are no longer able to grow or produce their own food. So it's a lack of nutrition because rising sea levels, salt water, for example, inundating those areas where they used to grow crops and things along those lines. Education important because they're talking about increasing connectivity for those students in countries, very remote countries, so they'll have better access to those learning tools. The forum also reached a consensus on a regional policing agreement. This is essentially creating a multi-nation police force, a specialized, specially trained police force that will be able to respond to a country's individual needs when they're called called into action. For example, cybercrime and drugs on the rise across the region, creating an ever-present problem. Also, countries can call this regional police force, for example, for an event such as the Pacific Islands Games, or respond to crises or natural disasters. By all accounts, leaders from the 18 nations say this year's 53rd annual Pacific Island Forum was a success.
That was Greg Navarro on the Pacific Island countries' annual summit. In Asia, global tourism has soared since the end of COVID-19 restrictions, and many visitors are choosing to travel to Asia. Industry insiders say travel to Asian countries is expected to rise more than any other region this year. Dusita Salko has more.
There was a time when Thailand was a whispered secret among the most seasoned of travellers. It was a hidden land where the allure of ancient temples, secluded beaches and mist-covered mountains existed just beyond the reach of tourist trails. And as Thailand's secret became common knowledge, the country transformed before the world's eyes. But it's not just Thailand. Across the region, governments are splashing billions of dollars to update and expand airport infrastructure. New airlines, like Thailand's Really Cool Airlines, which will start operations next year, are banking on an expected boom in air travel in Southeast Asia.
Given the geopolitics going on in the States, in Europe as well, Asia has been phenomenal in terms of growth. The pre-booking right now for us surpasses what we even anticipate, even before the planes are on the ground. So you can see that the potential on the outbound as well as inbound is going to be enormous.
The biggest boost to Asian tourism is coming from the region's own travellers. Visa-free policies offered by many countries have opened the door to the entire region, making travel easier than ever before. And it's Chinese tourists that are single-handedly driving the market. Asia's rise as a tourism hub mirrors its economic growth, with countries like China, India and Vietnam experiencing rapid development. This boom has improved infrastructure, making travel easier and creating a growing middle class eager to travel.
My company grows like 50 to 60% in terms of our business strategy that we tailor-made the program, and nowadays the trend of tourists or the groups, they looking for experientials, tailor-made the program, creativity, and moreover for like the value of money.
A subtle but undeniable shift is reshaping the global tourism map. The epicenter of global wanderlust is moving eastward. The challenge now is to manage this growth in a way that protects its natural and cultural assets while still welcoming the world with open arms.
That was Dusita Salko reporting. In China, the country has released a report on the coral reef ecosystem at Xianbin Jiao, a reef of its Nansha Islands in the South China Sea. It says the ecosystem there is generally healthy. The report from the Ministry of Natural Resources refutes the Philippines' claims of coral bleaching and death in the region. Sun Tianyuan reports.
Well, China released a survey on the coral reef ecosystem at Xianbin Jiao of its Nansha Islands. Scientists found that coral reef ecosystem there is generally healthy with abundant species. They asked the Ministry of Natural Resources regarding recent Philippine accusations against China, claiming Beijing is destroying the coral reefs and using the debris to build an artificial island. Chinese experts call the accusations groundless and without scientific evidence. They said the case at Xianbin Jiao are results of natural development. Analysis indicates that the case at Xianbin Jiao have sufficient materials to support their development and formation, and all complies with natural law. Marine scientists added that the K movement is bound to cause coral damage or death in certain surrounding areas, but to a limited extent. They also pointed out that the frequent activities of Philippine ships, including its Coast Guard, has caused significant damage to the coral reef ecosystem at Xianbin Jiao. Well, coral coverage is notably lower, especially where the Philippine Coast Guard ship 9701 is anchored than in other areas. Experts also noted that fishing nets and garbage were found mainly in the northwestern side of the reef, where Philippine fishing boats appear. Scientists believe these human activities have caused various damage to the ecosystem at Xianbin Jiao. They added further investigation and research are needed to ascertain the long-term impact.
That was Sun Tianyuan reporting. Finally, in Africa, Malawi, Zambia and Zimbabwe are facing severe drought. Crop yields have plummeted and water reserves are at historical lows, prompting the countries to declare a state of disaster. Farah Mwakatuya has more.
Last year, parts of southern Africa received below normal rainfall, leading to 3 countries, namely Malawi, Zambia and Zimbabwe, suffering severe drought. The prospects for the forthcoming season between October this year and March next year are much better, with most of the region forecast to receive normal to above normal rainfall.
In general, there's a transition from the El Nino to the La Nina, and we know that we are in the neutral phase. So generally, there's some improvement.
The La Nina phenomenon is typically associated with higher rainfall for southern Africa. More than 200 of the region's meteorological experts met in Zimbabwe's capital, Harare, to finalize the forecast and find ways to cope with erratic weather changes.
With climate change, the uncertainties are increasing and the frequency of these extreme weather events are becoming sort of more and more frequent. For example, in the past, a condition, a flooding that would occur 1 in 50 years is occurring 1 in 10 years. It's occurring 1 in 5 years.
Given the region's vulnerability to these extreme weather conditions, delegates meeting here have called for the strengthening of warning systems. This includes refining the data collected and getting it to those who need it early.
The product, first of all, to be downscaled at the relevant spatial and temporal scale, but then also to be communicated to the users that should take the right decision timelessly. What the farmer wants to know is not what is going to happen across the whole country, but it's what's going to happen in the field where they're plowing.
SADC member states have been encouraged to invest in developing human capital and improving technology for more accurate weather forecasting.
That was Farah Mwakatuya reporting. Now, recapping the headlines, the World Health Organization says Israel and Hamas have agreed to halt fighting in Gaza for a polio vaccination campaign that starts on Sunday. Leaders of Pacific Island countries have wrapped up their annual summit in Tonga. And China has released a report on the coral reef ecosystem at Xianbin Jiao, a reef of its Nansha Islands in the South China Sea. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to The Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news and magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.